Welcome, everybody, to the Live Ultralight podcast powered by Outdoor Vitals. I am Joe, and I am here today with
Brigham. I'm Tayson.
And today we are going to be talking about what goes into designing a ultralight trekking pole tent with the launch, corresponding with the launch of our new trekking pole tent here at Outdoor Vitals, the Fortius one-person and two-person trekking pole tents. So we're gonna dive deep into the design process of the Fortius, what you can expect from the Fortius, and I guess any sort of Fortius-related talk we can get into. But this podcast is all about inspiring you to get outdoors and lighten your pack so that you can live your life full of adventure. And I think that the Fortius, I'm sure that Tayson and Brigham will agree, is a great way to do that, to lighten your pack. So tell me first, what is a trekking pole tent for anyone who doesn't know, like me, that's even a thing, and how does that exactly lighten someone's pack, let's say if they're backpacking or fast packing, as we've been doing a lot recently at our...
Yeah. I mean, I can start off with the easy part. I'll let Brigham take the harder part. But so there's kind of three tiers of tents out there. There's freestanding, which means if you didn't put a single stake in the ground, it would still stand up. You've got semi-freestanding, which means you've got to stake out a few corners, but it still has poles and still has a general shape, and then you typically are pulling out a couple corners that require stakes. And then you've got non-freestanding. And a non-freestanding would mean it doesn't come with poles or doesn't utilize poles, or you basically have to use stakes in order for it to stand up in some way. So this would be categorized as a non-freestanding. There's no poles that come with it. It requires trekking poles for its support and structure, as well as the stakes in the ground. So that's kind of part one of it, is that you don't have to carry poles. But then maybe part two of why this piece is a little bit different to explain is just that it's not a double wall. So I'll let Brigham talk about that.
Right. Most freestanding tents, not all, but in general in the backpacking realm, most three-season backpacking freestanding tents will have an interior tent and an exterior fly, or could call it a tent. And then the interior is made up of a floor to protect from moisture and other things from the ground. And then generally, the walls and the roof of the interior tent are mostly mesh or a combination of mesh and, another fabric like polyester or nylon. And then the weather protection for precipitation is the exterior, or the second layer of the tent, that just covers the dome shape or whatever the tent shape is, and then it connects down at the corners down by the ground to the same points of the tent that are staked out or not staked out. But so that's generally like a double wall. The Fortius tent, or a trekking pole tent like ours, is basically, it's a single wall, meaning that there's not two separate pieces. It's all one piece. The tent is one piece that contains a floor, walls made of mesh, and then a nylon, call it a roof, right? The fly portion of the tent that protects the inside from rain or snow. It's a single wall tent.
Okay. What made you decide that you needed to make a trekking pole tent at Outdoor Vitals? Our Dominion is quite popular. Our Dominion is the freestanding non-trekking pole tent.
Right. I think it's just the ability to get lighter out there, and we're massive believers in trekking poles, so we already had those. And when you're trying to get ultralight, being able to double up on uses and purposes is always a big thing. But the Dominion is a great tent. It's very light for a freestanding tent. But when you get into this category, it's a totally different category of weight, you could say. So they're literally half the weight and size of a Dominion tent. So it's a pretty incredible jump for weight savings, it seems. And when you're already massive believers in trekking poles, that makes a lot of sense too. So that's the biggest thing for me is, I mean, a lot of people, talk about things like, oh, I just use a tarp or something like that because it's so light and so small. I don't like carrying a big tent or the poles or whatever. And this is like, it really almost feels like you're carrying a tarp. It's just that significantly light and small. So,
and a little bit of context that might help you, Joe, or anybody else of, in our realm of backpacking, we're always trying to be as light as possible and as functional as possible. So we're always analyzing. We talk a lot about gear on the podcast, obviously, and a lot of what we do as a company is trying to live ultralight or focus to try and take as little as we can to still have the experience that we're after. And so in whittling down pack weight, it's like a never-ending journey or a mentality of just trying to be deliberate and careful about what you take with you, and with that goal of carrying as little weight as possible with your other goals met as well. And so there's a lot of people in the backpacking community will be familiar with the term of like the big three, or the core items in backpacking. And those are the most significant pieces of gear that you generally need to have to go on a backpacking trip and walk for miles and stay in the backcountry. So those items are your backpack, your tent, and your sleep system. You could break that into your sleeping bag or quilt or your pad. But those 3 or 4 items are like your big three, right? And you can gain the most weight savings by carefully selecting from those items. By being very careful about what items in your big three you use, you can get the most weight savings or weight loss by addressing those, because they're a big item, right? So if you're talking about a backpack, you could compare one 45-liter backpack that weighs, let's just say, even it out, 2 pounds versus one that weighs 3.5 pounds. They could cost the same amount of money. So for the same amount of money, you can take away, say, 1.5 pounds or a pound with just one item. You can do the same thing with your sleep system. So if it's your sleeping bag, by choosing a down sleeping bag with a higher fill, like an 800 or higher fill power, and you can even do the same thing by going to a TopQuilt. And you can save in one of those big three items. You can reduce your pack weight for similar amount of money by 1 to 2 pounds just in a sleep system. And then you can do the same thing with your tent. So you get the most weight reduction or weight savings by carefully addressing your big three items. And so with a tent, like Tayson says, like you can cut your tent weight in half by addressing, going from a freestanding tent to a trekking pole tent. And like he already talked about, like we all believe in using trekking poles. And when I say believe, it means they provide us with a tangible physical benefit, meaning they make us more stable, they make our joints hurt less at the end of the day. And so it's assumed that we're always going to be backpacking with our trekking poles. And so being able to integrate a tent that uses trekking poles to hold the tent up and then stakes, we're able to knock 1 to 2 pounds off our tent weight. Mm-hmm. So that's just a little bit of background on some of that.
How long have trekking pole tents been around? I definitely never heard. Like, I didn't hear about it before coming here, and I just feel like
I don't know.
I mean,
when did they gain popularity, or how long have they been around?
Yeah,
it's probably
existed or like been more of a.
If you know the answer to either of those,
well, I mean, it can go back hundreds of years to when people had skins, right? Or if you go back to frontier times when people were using canvas, right?
Well,
they were using a stick at one end of the tent, which mimics.
They only have
at one point there was a new segment of outdoor gear created after people just got rid of the walking stick and then started manufacturing trekking poles. So post-manufacturing trekking poles,
probably between 20 and 25-ish years.
Okay. Because I guess you could probably use those trekking poles, and then you just used a tarp and like some like creativity with a rope and figured out a way to give yourself a shelter in that way. So I'm wondering when they've started like manufacturing these things where it's like wholesale, like what we've made here. Floor, roof, everything.
I would say they started to gain a lot of popularity, though, in the last 10 years, and a whole lot more popularity in the last 5 years. Yeah. And we're seeing a massive trend right now with companies that do surveys of like thru hikers and things like that, where it's significant year-over-year growth.
Yeah.
Like you're noticing year-over-year growth. And in fact, we just came off the trail from hiking the AT, and I would say 40+% of all tents out there were trekking pole tents that we saw. So it's just becoming more and more and more popular for sure. So I mean, but I'd say last 5 years it's become quite mainstream, and it just seems to be climbing more and more.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, what starts, I said 20, 25 years ago, that's like the advent of something, right? What usually starts as a very, very, very niche category or product, a couple decades later ends up being much more mainstream.
Yeah, it's called schema and variation is how I've heard that being called. It's like new idea happens, and then it takes that's the variation, and then the schema has to slowly change.
Sure.
Then it trickles through. Okay, so what is it about the Fortius that makes it special? Like, why did it take us, number one, like, what was the process, like, beginning to end, kind of what was the general process? Why is it taking so long? And what did we set out to do with the Fortius from the beginning? I guess is probably the best place to start.
I think, number one, Fortius as a name, I think has a Latin base.
So Fortius comes from the original Olympiad motto in Latin, Citius Altius Fortius, which means faster, higher, stronger. So Fortius, that's where the word Fortius comes from, and that's also why, as other languages developed, the term fort and things comes from derivation of strength, stronghold.
As we set out to do this, that was maybe one of the things just to start out with, is just to remember that name, because the Fortius tents are extremely light. In fact, I was just thinking about the first 2-person tent I ever backpacked with, and it was about a 6, almost 7-pound tent. And now like a Fortius 2-person, which actually has probably more square footage of room inside of it, you're talking 2 pounds, right? So just massive difference there. But so it is extremely light, but we didn't set out to make the lightest tent. What we made was the most performance-driven tent in our minds, being heavily weight conscious. And so Fortius to us was kind of this idea that a lot of these trekking pole tents, they push the limits of ultralight, and sometimes for the use cases that we sometimes put stuff in, maybe they could push too far. So, in the development of our tent, I'm sure you guys have seen that have followed us a while. You've seen us taking on snow loads and severe winds and hiking peaks and taking it to the desert. And it just has to perform in all of those scenarios for us to be happy. And really, it's become our fortress. And we've developed a ton of confidence in it. But we essentially wanted to push the limit of how light can we make it, but it needs to perform and be storm-worthy and not be something that you just are constantly questioning whether you can take it to this scenario or not.
Yeah, I think that last statement of like questioning, like we want to be able to generally go backpacking anywhere that's reasonably accessible. Meaning like we're not going to...
It's not a North Pole expedition.
Yeah, going to Nepal or the Himalayas is not reasonably accessible for us, but in general... mass market backpacking, we want to be able to take our tent on any backpacking trip, say in the United States or North America, right? Yeah. Maybe not certain parts of Alaska, but and be comfortable doing that. But we also don't want to hunk around a ton of weight too. So that's just a pretty important point. Is like, from the outset of the project was to, just think about well, yeah, we want the weight savings of a trekking pole tent, but we also want to have confidence in it where we go, which could be anywhere. And like Tayson said, like the desert, it's just really hot there and sandy. But at 12,000 feet, there's no trees and there's always a lot of wind. And there's always, the threat of freezing conditions and stuff like that. So having confidence and being comfortable using this tent in pretty much any backpacking scenario.
Yeah, so that affected things like fabric choice. That affected things like where we put guy lines, how many guy lines, our little storm points that are movable. All those things kind of came into consideration because, yeah, there's a significant amount of nights a year that we're all sleeping at 10,000 plus feet, or there's times that I've gone to Alaska or different things where like it needs like those things all build into that finished product of having a lot more confidence in it than say some of the pieces that might have an even lighter weight fabric and don't have as many storm points.
I mean, did you guys go through like the competitions? Like their trekking pole tents?
Yeah, I think you've got to be aware of everything that you can find out there and know it and whatnot. But in the end, really what it boils down to so much for us is just the performance aspect. Yeah. And that comes into the design too, as far as like one of the things that one of our competitors do per se is they make an extremely light tent. Fabrics are extremely light, but they also do things like, all right, there's a head end and there's a foot end, and the foot end is like 21 inches wide, and if you couldn't pitch your tent in a way that allowed your head end to be uphill, you would have to cram your head down into this tiny little foot space, and it would be really tough when you're my size, when you're over 6 foot, especially. And so when it comes down to designing our tent, we wanted to make it, if we're doing a head end and a foot end, that's fine. But the nights that I have to switch and put my head in the foot end, it still needs to work very well. So there's considerations like that where it just means performance in the field, in real world scenarios is where we're trying to test and build the product for.
Yeah, I think some of the cool behind the scenes backstory about like the development as it went over was, we always want to start with like our objectives and what we want to accomplish. So like we don't start with the name of a product, obviously. So we didn't say like, well, we want to design a Fortius tent, and that means it's strong, so we have to design a strong tent. Actually, the name came when the tent was basically done. But what was interesting is we had the objectives and what we wanted to accomplish, and we tried many different iterations of slightly different shapes, measurements, heights, lengths, widths, but they all at every level were like tested in the field in probably unexpected, worse than we wanted or thought conditions, and that's great. Like that's great, and that's what refined and changed every iteration that we went through until we get to kind of like we're like 80 or 90% there. And now then we just go with the tent and take it everywhere. And what's interesting is that when it came time to naming it, it really only took reflection back over time to people's experiences, whether it was Tayson, me, or other guys on the team. And a very common theme that just kind of surfaced organically, naturally in people's own minds was like the confidence in the tent that they would have, this idea of it like feeling like it's this refuge and this like in horrible weather like in the Uintas, like it. I think several of us talked about it being like, man, that's like our last stand in this right by this mountain pass. And so like a lot of that just mental effect that it had on people, that kind of drove the name in the end because it proved itself out what we wanted it to be. And so naturally I felt like the name worked itself out pretty well because everybody felt the same way about the tent, having had those experiences when they're just like soaking wet and cold and it's windy, and within 20 minutes they need to be out of the wind or they're going to be hypothermic. And so like we all experienced that through the development of the tent. And so it's pretty cool that it ended up that way with the name that it has, and a lot of the testing.
So, how long of a process was this? I know that this tent has been done for at least a couple months, and a lot of people, because we were still making YouTube videos, and you'd be out there on the trail, there'd be a wide shot or something, be like, and tons of comments going, "What's that tent?
Yeah.
What is that? What are you using?"
That's the thing is, I mean, we've been so wrapped up in the development of the tent for so long that most of our YouTube videos do have the Fortius in it. You know what I mean? Like 90% of them. So, and we snuck information out about it so early on because we were very close at one point to having it all done, and then COVID hit, and we basically lost our tent manufacturer. And that drug out and took a long time, and then we had to rebuild the tent with a new manufacturer. And it all worked out to be good though, because yes, we potentially could have released the tent, I don't know, almost a year or a year and a half ago at this point.
Or it was that of it,
like the first version. But the thing is, part of the good of it was that we continued to improve upon it until we've got this version. And just being out on the trail with it the last month, I've spent an abnormal amount of time in April and May on the trail. The improvements which we made have been awesome. So to answer your question, it's probably been 3+ years of development to get to this stage. But the good of that is 3+ years of extra R&D, extra tweaking, extra fine tuning. Someone asked Brigham on a podcast he was doing with me, and asked, what's the hardest product to develop? And I think Brigham's answer was tents, because they are truly can be quite difficult at times to develop and in different ways. But thankfully, we've got an awesome partner of ours now on the job, one that we've worked with, and everything's been going quite quickly since then. But yeah, we had like this massive issue in the middle of the process that delayed it. But yeah, it's been awesome because some of the tweaks that we've been doing in these final stages have even been, increasing some of the headroom in it, and, increasing the ability for it to pitch easier and more taut. And, I appreciated the heck out of those when I was just on the AT, because I could pitch it faster. And one of the times it started raining on us right as I was setting up the tent, and, you can set it up in the rain without getting anything inside. But then I sat inside of it for, an hour, maybe an hour and a half or something like that. And I just had plenty of space, even in the one person, to spread out. I brought my whole pack inside the tent, not even the vestibule, inside the tent, blew up a pad, doubled up the pad, sat on it, ate food. It was like, it's nice because that wasn't in the first ones, that amount of headroom and some of those things. But we were able to build those in and not increase the weight. And so we've just made a better finished product, even though you guys have had to wait for like 3 years for this thing.
So I have stats in front of me right now of each of these things. So the weight of the Fortius one person, the base weight is 1.6 pounds. If you include stakes and cords and a stuff sack with it, that is 1 pound, 12 ounces. The two-person tent, the base weight is 2.25 pounds with everything included. I think there might be a typo in here. I don't know what the actual weight is when you include like the stakes and the stuff sack, but I assume it's like the first one person, it's about another 4 ounces probably. Do we have a place where they can see all the stats on these things? I assume, right? On our website?
Yeah. So we're currently taking pre-sales on the Fortius for Live Ultralight members. So for our members of our membership, you can currently pre-order it at a big discount, $65 off of the tent, either one of them. Yeah. So if you do want to see the specs on it, you'll be able to pull those inside there, and yeah, you'll be able to pre-order it at a big discount. Yeah. And it's not a long pre-order cycle. These are done. They're finishing up right now. They're basically moving into shipping to us. So it's not like a Kickstarter type pre-sale where it's going to be 6+ months.
I would point out, Tayson said it's available to pre-order if you're a member, but the membership is an open membership. So anybody can sign up to become a member to get the tent. So you don't have to be like an existing member now. You're not restricted from signing up is what I'm saying. So if somebody is interested in the tent, they could consider joining the membership to get the tent right away.
Cancel
or
anytime.
to
Sign up,
pre-order right
sign up, get the tent, cancel. It's all optional.
Yeah. Yeah.
You won't though, because you'll.
Is that what we're encouraging now?
They're welcome to do it. It's that way, but they won't because they'll love it.
Okay. Tell me about what it's made out of, the Fortius tent. Like, what are storm points? What? Let's start with the cloth, I guess. What is it made out of?
Joe,
what can you tell us?
We've done fabric podcasts. You just called it cloth.
I'm sorry. The fabric.
It's all right.
Tell us about picking the fabric, and actually all of, like, the hardware involved with the tent. Well, why did you pick what you've picked here?
Well, we decided to use a 15 denier ripstop nylon. That's, for us, we found that to be a good balance of the durability and the strength that we want, and balancing the weight. So not being kind of achieving the strength and durability objectives that we have, and being happy with the weight. If we went lighter, then we wouldn't have been happy with the objectives that we had in the beginning. That's the fabric. There's a lot of fabric on the tent, so that's a majority of the tent. We use it's a no-see-um mesh for the inside doors and the ventilation walls.
Big panels.
That's a big part of this tent, is the ventilation, right?
Yeah, so on the two tents are slightly different in design and shape. We can get into that in a bit. But yeah, so materials, then we use guy lines with bright yellow guy lines that are high vis with reflective properties, and then line lock tensioners at the corners, YKK zippers.
Lots of line though.
I would
specify that.
I did want to just add, when you were talking about the product weight and things. So one of our objectives, for having, let's just sum it all up as call it like stormworthiness for the tent. For stormworthiness, we just want to set people up, as soon as they receive the tent, like it's ready to go and no lines needed. You don't need to add extra line or anything. So there's a lot of line on these tents. So all the corners, the vestibules, they have long lines. And I can get into that in a second, but so there's a lot of cord on this tent, and our tent includes 8 stakes. And where you only need 6 to set up the tent. But going back to wanting people to have a stormworthy tent the second they receive it, some of the things that go into that are, if you get hit with a storm in the Appalachians or above the tree line in the Rocky Mountains, and you have a temperature drop and you get soaked because the rain just hits and you didn't have time to put on a rain jacket, well, you're now on a clock. You're basically on a clock to get yourself protected from the elements because you're on a clock for getting hypothermia. The ideal tent site doesn't exist everywhere. And so we didn't want to build a limiting tent. We wanted to build a tent that had as much adaptability and ability to
It's got options.
Work wherever you are, find the flattest spot you can as soon as you can, and have, I would say our tent probably has an extra 18 to 24 inches of line compared to some options out there. And all that means is, if you want to sleep where it's flat, so if you have to extend a cord an extra 15 inches so that you can sleep on that flat spot, well, then we want our customer to be able to do that. So we have long guy lines, long stakeout lines, and that, I guess if somebody wants to be, really gram conscious,
cut them down,
cut them off, tie a knot at the end, cut them off, and just be selective about where you go and just be careful about that. But our tent gives people the option, better tent side options, and there's no head end or foot end, because again, that that places a restriction on your sleep, on your shelter system. So, and then having the 2 extra stakes there's a point for having those 2 extra stakes. We have around the tent what we call storm points. They're little reinforced D-rings that extend out from the bottom edge of the tent. And then we include 2 detachable guy lines for the storm points that you basically snap over the D-ring, and they have a line lock tensioner on them. And that, you can reinforce or put 2 extra stakeouts at the end of the tent or the side of the tent that the wind is blowing from, blowing the heaviest wind. And so that reinforces, it creates more tension on the body of the tent. And so that's all included with the tent, because we don't want you to have to buy an extra 2 stakes and buy an extra 2 lines and buy extra line to replace the existing line so that you have longer line. So the tents come set up to really handle a lot of weather that you otherwise wouldn't be able to do without having to just go out and source some extra stakes and lines.
I'd like to add just the observation that since I've started working here, pretty much everybody on the team except for me has changed over from using the Dominion to using the Fortius, and it's now become pretty much everyone's first choice when it comes to what tent they bring on our backpack.
Everyone starts hanging around the design department when it's time for a trip, and just starts bugging Brigham to see if there's an extra Fortius around. That's true. I mean, it's a thing.
The reason I've been slow too is because I'm slow to trekking pole. I've never been a trekking pole hiker. I think Derek in the office was the other person who wasn't a trekking pole hiker, and now since the tent has become one.
Yeah.
But now, honestly, I had a pretty good slip and fall on the Grand Canyon trip, and then the trekking poles became my way out of that. I was keeping the trekking poles in my backpack because I'm I'm not going to use them, and then suddenly I wanted the stability of the trekking poles, and now I'm starting to see, maybe next time we go out, maybe I should probably try one.
Yeah.
Try one of the Fortius tents. I definitely, because I've had to do the photography on it, I've set it up, and with the one person especially, when I put that thing up by myself by this river area, I was oh no, this actually goes up pretty easily. This is a lot more intuitive than I thought it was, just setting up the tent. I thought it was going to be a hassle to put up, because of, balancing everything out and everything like that. And there was a bit of that, to make it photo worthy, pulling all the lines and making everything flush and everything like that. But
that's also probably your second time setting it up too.
Never set up that one person.
Yeah.
That was my first time setting that up.
The more you set it up, the less you'll even say that much too. I said this in a video that we filmed that's probably not public yet. I said, I think I can set this up as fast as anyone can set up a freestanding tent. And I stand by that, especially if they're staking it out like they should be, because a lot of people don't, and then in the middle of the night they get wind, and then they're getting hammered and they have to go put stakes up, right? But if you're going to make it, put your stakes in and do it right, you really can set it up quite quickly.
What surprised me was the intuitiveness, where it was just I put this here and then have it kind of staked already, and then I put it up, and then it makes the line really taut, and I just I don't know, I didn't have to think about it nearly as much as I thought I would have to.
I mean, and to build more.
Which, to be fair, by the way, with the Dominion, the first time I set up the Dominion, I was what the heck? Why are the ends 2 different sizes? Am I on the right size? They're so there was and I had never used a tent with only a single pole, I guess.
Instead of 2 straight ones you slide in.
So I was so confused
the
first time we did the Dominion. So actually this was easier for me to set up on the first time with no training.
That's interesting.
Than the Dominion was. Anyway, sorry, go ahead.
Well, no, that is interesting. And to build on Brigham's point a little bit further, just with the extra line length that we provide and stuff like that, it really does make all the difference in the world. Because we're setting it up in deserts, and sometimes there's rocks around, or you set it up on top of a mountain. But even out on the AT, it's just really fresh for me. There's a lot of roots, and you're trying to get around them. And so sometimes I was extending this corner just needed an extra foot to be able to get a better stake in the ground and stuff like that. And it really does just make it more forgiving. And I have to stake in less because let's say I do pitch it and the ground is uneven and it starts to get like a weird, maybe a little crease on it or something. A lot of times there's so much forgiveness in those lines that you can kind of loosen this line and tighten this line and just tweak them enough that you can totally get the correct pitch without having to restake either. So it is really quick. And then too, I mean, there's so much with this tent that's useful, but like you can also kind of pitch it a little higher and get extra ventilation, or you can pitch it a little lower if you're expecting a ton of wind. Like there's maybe like a small bit of art form even with pitching the tents. Not that you need it or need a lot of experience with it, because you really don't, but the more you're around that tent, the more confident and comfortable you get with it. And and then, there's scenarios when there's some areas that I like to go that are like you barely step below 12,000 feet. And in those scenarios, I will be bringing, extra storm points, which, we will offer, and extra stakes, because I'm probably just going to do every storm point with a bunch of extra stakes, knowing that at any given time I could be away from my tent and I could have something roll in that could cause a lot of grief. But if I've got all those in, I feel a ton of confidence around it. And that's way lighter than packing in a much heavier tent with poles and such. So there's that. And then going back to that initial point where you said, I didn't like it because I didn't use trekking poles. We are working, and eventually we'll have options for some poles that you can buy that will just snap in. It'll just be the correct length and you can pop them into the tent. Obviously they're only going to be like, 40-inch type length poles or whatever they are, but
so they're not specifically trekking poles, they're poles for the tent.
Yeah.
Interesting.
They would just be a fixed length, just retractable pole, basically.
But if you guys want a good pair of poles, we do offer the Compradale poles through our Live Ultralight membership. A link will be in the description of this episode, as well as a link to our page for the Fortius. So you guys can go check it out and go to more detail. You can see how many centimeters tall a certain section of the tent is if you want to kind of go into that stuff, all the stuff that Brigham and Tayson have been whittling down to as far as like getting this tent ready to go and ready to go publicly. Is there anything else about this tent that you want people to know?
Yeah,
there's a ton.
There's a ton. Okay, well, I'll just let you go for it, because do you still have a hard out at 3:30?
When I get a text, I'll have to pop out.
Okay.
So we've talked about like some of our objectives, right? I think we've covered that, but there's things that can only get designed into a tent from basically experience. So one of the terms or things I try to constantly think about is empathetic design, meaning like design from experience. So how many, we've talked about getting caught in the storm and wanting to hurry up and set up your tent and just get in there and get sheltered. But I think there's probably a lot of people that can relate to this, where if you are caught in a storm and then you do hurry up and set up your tent, now you're dripping wet and your backpack's dripping wet. Everything's just wet, but you just want to be dry. We wanted the tent to be like not just this tiny little refuge that you crouch down in and curl up in the fetal position and don't dare move because there's water everywhere. And this came through just like several events over the years of testing the tent, where we would have to get in the tent in a hurry and soaking wet, and everything's wet, backpack's wet, shoes are soaked, and like if you get in the tent, you're trying to just like change out of your wet clothes into your dry clothes, blow up your pad, get out your top quilt, but you don't want the rain to come in, but you want the protection, so you zip up the vestibule. Those are all things that come to mind with our tent design in terms of space and usable space and vestibule space. Our tents have large vestibules, and that's because it's like an indirect process of the storm worthiness. if you're going to get caught in a storm, we want you to be able to keep your wet stuff out of the tent.
That is one of my favorite things about
part
our
of
tents,
having a storm-worthy tent is if you have to get in the tent soaking wet, fine, but we want people to have the option to leave their backpack in the vestibule. Even in the one-person tent, it could fit 2 backpacks easy in the vestibule, but being able to leave that backpack out there and keep the inside of your tent as dry as possible, and then as you're changing out of your soaking wet clothes, you're not bumping up against the roof or the walls, and just having that space to just get comfortable. Psychologically, that gives a very, very quick boost of confidence and morale, to get out of the wind and just get dry and stay dry and not worry about your wet things inside the tent getting your dry things wet and all that. So that's one thing that I think will be very noticeable when people get these in their packs and out into the field, is the one person has a large vestibule, and on the other side it has, I wouldn't call it, it's sort of like a vestibule. It's not meant for access to storage, but it's an overhang that overlaps the back wall of the tent for ventilation. So we wanted a lot of ventilation there. Now the 2-person tent is a double door, double vestibule. So now you're talking 2 people and 2 people's gear. So same scenario, 2 people soaking wet climbing into a tent. You don't want them climbing over each other, and you don't want them passing wet backpack to go out into the vestibule, right? So that scenario was also proven in our field testing throughout the team.
What's even better is the double door situation. In that 2-person tent, there's so most multi-person tents still only have 1 door, I'd say, in the industry that I'm aware of. And the fact that you guys have you can go through the 2-person tent because there's actually 2 doors available to you.
Yeah,
and so, therefore 2 whole vestibule areas for 2 different backpackers.
Yeah. So in the storm scenario, that's why it's that way. That's why the design is as it is for that. You're soaking wet. 2 guys just need to just get in the tent and get dry and not be dripping water all over the place and getting everything wet. Now, if it's not stormy, the advantage of that is there's always going to be a weather side and a non-weather side of the tent. So open up the non-weather side and you'll have massive ventilation with that 2-person tent. So that's kind of how we accounted for that.
I think we got to talk about the ventilation side of it too, because people get really concerned when you say single wall tent. Oh my gosh, a single wall tent. I want the double wall for the ventilation. Well, the way we've built this is that there's mesh on the 2, the head and the foot end, there's mesh. And then on both the sides, there's massive panels of mesh. So like you mentioned on the 1 person, let's say, the side you're not getting in and out, it's just this big mesh wall essentially. And then on the door side, it's a ton of mesh. And so even sleeping in tons of humidity and having it rain on you that night, waking up the next morning, it vents extremely well. And I think that's huge. And I think one of the things, there are some potential advantages of a double wall tent. And they say you're not going to brush up against the side. Well, the space is the same. It's just now you are limiting, 3 inches off of the roof so that you don't touch the top, you know what I mean? But the same amount of condensation essentially builds up in the inside. You just kind of have this little barrier that helps you avoid touching it. Or if it falls onto the mesh, and maybe the mesh catches some of it instead of having it fall through. But I would say the ventilation on these is just superb. It's very rare you get an abnormal amount of condensation inside there, and even when you do, it's super manageable. And then kind of going with the space thing, one of the last nights I had on trail, it started to rain on us. We pitched the tent, and there are an obscene amount of spiders out in Virginia. I cannot believe the amount of spiders. So I wasn't about to leave my pack and stuff out in my vestibule even. So I was bringing my pack into the 1-person tent with me with all of my gear. Everything that wasn't going in the bear hang was in there with me. And there's space for it. I would just take everything out of my backpack. I'd put that down where my feet went, lay it sideways, My feet would go on the pack. Everything else could easily fit up around my head. So yeah, there's space in this thing, which is part of why it just makes it so dang amazing that the weight that it comes in at. Also, there's a little bit of a cant to the poles, and there's just elbow room and just space inside of there that we've very purposely built into the finished product that helps when you've got to be in your tent for a few hours. Or some people that might be hiking a through hike, they might just say looks like it's going to be raining all day. I'm going to take a day's a 0 day. And when you take a 0 day, it's a long day in a tent, and so that's when that extra space really matters. That's where it's 100 times better than being under a tarp, which some ultralight guys want to do, is you just be under a tarp. Also, it kept me safe from all the spiders out there, but also it's still an extremely light shelter that in your hand feels almost like you're carrying a tarp more than you're carrying a tent.
Yeah. Just like a piece of cloth. Could you tell me about so the one-person tent has an interesting design feature, and it's like one side is completely square towards the door, and the other side is almost like bowled out. You know what I'm talking about?
You're talking about the difference in height?
The back wall of the floor?
Yeah, the floor.
How it arcs?
So, yeah, how it arcs. Yeah, arc is a better word than bold.
So, yeah, this is a hard thing to verbally describe. So if you were to set up the tent and look at the front door of the tent, unzip it, roll it back, and look through to the back of the tent, okay, you're going to see the floor. The floor has vertical walls. On that back side of the tent, the vertical wall is kind of like a shallow arc shape. Yeah. That's what you're talking about, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's to work in conjunction with the overhang of the back. I'll just call it vestibule. So we wanted the back vestibule. We played with different heights to achieve the ventilation we want, but also not have rain come in. Mm-hmm. So it's basically how those two work together prevents any kind of splash in from raindrops.
So it's high enough to give you a good airflow, but because of the curve that
you're talking about the arc on the bathtub floor.
Yeah.
So that's partially for visibility and security. By raising up the back vestibule higher, we get more airflow. But by raising up the back vestibule higher, you can see straight into someone's tent. Mm-hmm. So we kind of did this compromise where we brought up the back a little bit of the vest. It's not a vestibule, but the back side overhang. And then we brought up the bathtub floor a little bit higher to make sure that you've still got full privacy in there, but we're getting maximum ventilation and also keeping the weight down, because if we, we're trying to also achieve like at one time the vestibule went clear to the ground more so, and that's more weight. And then by pulling that up, we could get more roof height, but not sacrifice having more fabric. And so it all played in together to be the lightest weight, most vented option that still provides, visible security if someone's walking by your campsite.
And rain protection. Yeah. So balancing the visibility from the outside, the privacy with the rain protection and the ventilation.
Yeah. Anything else you want to say about the tent?
Well, the only other thing that we've covered is the one-person tent doesn't look the same. It's not a one-person version of the two-person tent, right? They have the same, Fortius.
They have a lot of the same features. Very,
very similar, except for the Fortius 1. If you look at it from the head or the foot end, you'll see that it uses two poles, but they're at different heights. Mm-hmm. The purpose for that is wind shed. So achieving, when you have differing angles that the wind hits, it sheds that wind a lot better from every direction than if the two poles were at the same height. Now with the two-person tent, you can still achieve a really desirable wind shed because it's more of it's got different shapes coming from different directions because it's symmetrical. Mm-hmm. It's got the double vestibules. So it has that windbreak, whereas on the back side of the one-person tent, it's not a vestibule. It's just that kind of that overhang.
So that's to make up for that, is to
it makes it handle the wind better.
Yeah.
There's also one extra tie point on the two-person to help it shed some of the wind a little bit more.
Because it's a broader
bigger panels.
Tent panel.
Mm-hmm. So,
all right, guys. Well,
What else we got here, Brigham? We might have got through a lot of it.
Yeah, without going into however many centimeters it is in this section of the tent. I think we've got a pretty good idea of this. You guys have been working on this for a long time, and we're, as a company, we're very proud of this product. We hope you guys will check it out. Again, links in the description below if you want to learn even more about the Fortius tents. We'd appreciate it if you go check those out and pre-order now. There you go. Guys, if you could leave a comment on our YouTube channel or leave a review in iTunes, we sure would appreciate it. Subscribe wherever you're listening to this, whether it's on iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts. And we got a lot of cool stuff coming up, so stay tuned for that, and thank you for listening.